and we should be live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So hopefully everybody can see and hear us. Okay. Good afternoon. My name's James. Thanks for joining us. It's really appreciated. Kind of a cold November, almost kind of getting that Christmas feeling kind of afternoon. So if you're tuning in after work, just massive thanks for doing so and being along with us. It's really appreciated. For anybody who works with us on a regular basis on the website, some of you will know that today's been a really difficult day. Not going to get too much into that, just to say that we know, believe us, we know, believe me, we know, and it will be resolved shortly. Yeah, and I don't know, I'm sorry really, don't know what words to use, just trying to sort it out. Okay, that being said, let's get on with it. This session is about literally mastery models of learning. So where do we go with that? I mean, we've probably all developed and moved into a profession which has certain assumptions and structures which seem to be default. And within this session, we're going to challenge that idea. We're going to challenge the idea of those defaults, of those static assumptions. We're going to try and kind of prod and poke until we get something which is really, potentially really rich as an output. And that I would hope would move us closer to a system and educational model which is kind of how human beings actually learn, rather than the dominant structures being based upon what has always been there. And I guess that's kind of where we're going with this. I would imagine that by the end of this session, it's very predictable that we're going to provide you with some answers, but almost certainly more questions to ask. I think that's very predictable. And as always, the objective for me is to provoke in a really supportive and compassionate way, so that the possible output at the end of this session is kind of really deep reflection and challenging those things which seem to be at the core of what we do, but perhaps are not reliably so. So we're going to do that. We don't expect the session to go anything over an hour today, maybe slightly shorter depending on questions, but we'll be in and around that kind of level. So all that being said, I'm gonna switch over to our kind of Canvas stream. Just going to take me about 10-15 seconds. I'm the only one in the office studio today, so I've got a couple of buttons to press, and I've got to switch microphones as well. So you'll just kind of see a non-active screen just for a few seconds while we make that transition. But all that being said, let's actually get on with it. So let's get started. Okay, so look, here we go. Let's make a sort of a good start to this. I want to talk here, obviously, about mastery models of learning. Now, I guess in my opinion, this is a real kind of over-application of jargon and terminology, because for me, it's just how people learn. Okay, so I'm not going into here the nuances of different modalities, different theories of learning, but for me personally, the concept of truly learning something means that you have the opportunity to master that thing, that opportunity is tailored to you and is actually structured and paced by you. These are assumptions I make in my life and in my work. And if we have a model that differs greatly from that, then we have to accept that there are implications to that. We have to accept that there are serious compromises and restrictions that are going to operate within that. So, I mean, I would describe some of those restrictions in the following formats. And whenever we talk about what we might loosely call here the current paradigm, we are not talking about any individual's teaching. We are talking about a global picture of how things might be in some kind of typical or average experience, as things broadly are. So I know completely that there's fantastic and wonderful things happening in many classrooms, and I'm sure in yours. But let us put down what we think are some of the current paradigm features. Broadly speaking, and please note that word broadly, we're talking about broadly a one-pace-fits-all model. A one-pace-fits-all model.
And notice the word model at the end of this. That does not mean that your classroom and the teaching that you provide to your students is one pace fits all. It means that the model is one pace fits all. How would we sort of identify that? Well, we'd see children in age range batches. We'd see children, for example, who are being moved through a course at a standard rhythm, moving from topic 1 to topic 2 to topic 3, for example, within a scheme of work. We have a scheme of work as opposed to a scheme of learning, and the scheme is based usually around time. So it's a one pace fits all model broadly. We also know it's a one pace fits all model if, for example, differentiation is not built into the model but is bolted on. It can only need to be bolted on if the model itself is one pace fits all. So that is a current indicator of where we are systemically at the moment, rather than individual experiences. So we'd say something else in here. We're saying here that the course moves on, regardless of mastery. Okay, so what we mean by that is that we would expect that if someone's taking, I don't know, let's say a Cambridge technical course, or they're taking a GCSE or something along those lines, then that course is going to move at a certain rhythm. And no matter what level of mastery the student is going to have achieved after week 2, the course is going to progress onwards. Now, of course, again, there are exceptions to that, but we're talking about the dominant structure of the paradigm here. We'd also add to that, and I think some of you probably understand this more than I do, for example, but we're broadly talking here about an industrial process or an ideology of industrialization applied to an educational model. And some of you kind of, I don't know if you'll be aware of this or you'll be surprised to know this, and I don't know, but one of the things that kind of scared me a little bit when I was studying for my leadership qualifications with the ILM was that our sort of quality assurance processes are built on a Japanese model. Okay, so the quality assurance processes, let me write that in quickly, that we use in education, whether we're using our own, just my microphone here, whether we're using our own school-based ones or we're using something like Pixel, for example, they're based on Japanese quality assurance processes which were designed and established in the 60s and 70s for computer component technology. So that is a kind of a slightly concerning structure. Now, I would say that those quality assurance processes of process, test, those would be really fantastic, and very rigorous testing, by the way. That model would be really, really effective if, for example, we were producing sausages in a factory, or we were producing perfectly shaped and conditioned paint tins, for example. Those processes would probably work really, really well. Those standards and minimizing deviations and defects would work really well. Are they working really well in education? If they are operating in education, what global impacts do they have? And I think those are perfectly legitimate questions to answer. And another point we'd sort of make over here is that errors are negative. Okay, so if we look in the average classroom, we're looking to minimize errors made by learners. We're looking to eradicate errors made by learners. We're looking to confirm that errors are not present. Okay, and errors are often sort of deemed as some sort of indicator of ability, or even in this kind of Japanese quality assurance process of some notion of a defect. Okay, let me put that in inverted commas, so some notion of a defect. And of course, this can lead to some issues of labeling, believing we can, for example, label someone's learning potential. We might systemically feel that, or we might systemically use those processes. But what we very likely are using is the process of categorization. Categorization by setting, by performance, by ability, in inverted commas. These processes are probably happening in the schools that we're working in on a systemic level, even if they're not happening within our classrooms. And a couple of things I just want to add to that. And I actually meant to put it over here, but I didn't leave myself enough space. We'd also say that it comes out from that Japanese computer component methodology, that testing is snapshot. What do we mean by that? Testing is snapshot. Well, we are suggesting here that the experience of learning and the experience of testing or data extraction are separate. So what we tend to find is that within some notion of an average classroom, we'd have learn, test. Then we'd have learn, test, and I think we can probably all recognize that kind of model. But one of the things that perhaps we miss out when we make that assumption, or if we practice that, is why is this learning, why are they not producing data? If they're producing data ongoing, a couple of things would happen. First of all, you might not have the need for such a kind of a robust summative testing experience. That's up for you to decide. I mean, I have my own views on that. But the other thing you would know is that this could be 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks, and then you get to the test and then you find out there's a problem. Well, that means that all of this time has been spent already, and any kind of remedial or any kind of diagnostic input from this testing data is going to be, obviously, let's say in this case, 4 weeks down the line, when in fact the issue might have happened here. And that would seem to me to be too late, at least from the point of view of the learner. So those are some conditions, those are some issues we would argue are relevant with the current paradigm. My microphone is sort of collapsing on me. I'm not totally sure why. So I'm trying to sort of hold it up while I do this. So the questions I would ask for you is, can any of these things be manipulated? Can any of these things actually be changed? Now, I can't answer that for anybody else, but I've answered that question for me and applied the answer to that question in many, many classrooms. All right, a couple of other things I want to talk about with regard to the current paradigm, because I think it allows us to understand what we're going to talk about shortly in more detail. I've put this box in here because somehow I'm broadly saying that this is learning within this box, okay? And I'm interested, I guess, in 3 things with learning. I'm interested in the development of skills, I'm interested in the development of knowledge, and I'm interested in the development of behaviours. And let me be clear, when I say behaviours, I'm not particularly talking about good behaviour or being a good, being a well-behaved student. I'm talking about behaviours which I would broadly consider to be learning behaviours. Things such as engagement, persistence, regularity, completion, concentration. I'm talking about those learning behaviours that even coming down, I mean, it links onto skill, even coming down to something like, does the learner know how to use a dictionary? Okay, how does a dictionary actually operate? Now, I don't just mean looking at the order of the chronological, it's not chronological, the spelling order, I can't think of the right word to use, of words in a book, but having a look at how words can be formatted in the grammatical structures of those things. Can we develop that behaviour and that skill in the learner? And what I'm arguing here is that if we broadly call this point here the start point, so this line here is going to be the start line, let's say it's day 1 of our course, if we sort of say, broadly speaking, this is kind of like what we might loosely call mastery. I mean, think of mastery in any format you want, whether it's mastering a skill or whether it's getting a very high grade, for example. You can define that for yourself. But one of the things that we can be confident with is if we take into account skills, knowledge, and behaviours, what we're going to find with different students is that this student starts at this point. Okay, this student starts at this point. We've got this student who's a very successful student who starts at this point. They're much higher with regard to skills, knowledge, and behaviours. We might have another student who even starts at this point. We might have numerous students that start at this point, and we might have other students still who start at points such as these. And the question we've now got, and the idea of this, of course, is that what each student is trying to do is trying to make progress, as I've just indicated with that yellow line. Okay, so maybe this student is going to get to that level. Maybe this student here is going to make that progress and actually had a lot more potential to go further in the time that was available. But of course, this student here is quite likely to fall short. Perhaps this student, let's call this the average student, this student here is likely to fall short. And why is this happening? Why is this falling short happening for some and not others? And what we're going to argue here is this happens because, as we've just talked about, there are standard processes applied to all. Okay, standard processes applied to all. That's one of the reasons that's going to happen. And we're going to argue that there's going to be some differentiation bolted on. But I'm going to say something a little bit provocative here. Some differentiation in spite of the model. Okay, so despite the model, the one pace fits all model being in place, we're going to bolt on differentiation and put it in place in spite of the model itself. Okay, we're also going to argue here. I'm not sure why I've changed color, but I've done it now. So what we're going to say here is that we've got ideas where classroom and homework are the main experiences. Classroom and homework are main experiences, and this point's really important. I'm going to write here, but broadly separate, with exceptions, of course. That the experience of classwork and homework are going to be somehow separate and distinct from one another. A student is going to take certain processes in the class and take different processes in that homework type scenario. And a classic example, of course, is that classroom is where the teaching happens, the delivery, the explanation of things. Why? Why is that? Why is it that that's only available there? And if we start to answer questions like that, then we can come up with a very, very different kind of model that's available to our students. And finally, we often find in this non-mastery model that teaching is what we call a one-off deal. Okay. In other words, I don't know, I'm teaching recovery, and my recovery my recovery teaching is available in October on a Thursday morning between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, and that's when I teach that thing, and then that teaching is kind of done for the year. Okay, or we might come back to it in revision, or I might reteach it when we do a revision session or when we do a top-up session, that kind of thing. Now, what I want to sort of introduce to you now is that with the basic premise of mastery, we're talking about something which is really different. Even though physically things like classrooms don't change a great deal, even though that we could use the exact infrastructure that we've got right now within our educational structures, which of course is very beneficial, the premise, the ideology, the philosophy of the mastery model is different to what I've just talked about. So a couple of things about mastery. Mastery learning is always, I'm going to put that in inverted commas because always, as I'm sure you realise, whenever someone says always, unless they're talking about some kind of law of nature, it generally isn't always, it's often not even most of the time, but we're saying here that learning is always self-paced. Now, I know that's going to lead to some questions. I am going to try and address those as we go. But let me be clear and provocative if it comes to it. I am arguing absolutely that learning through structures of educational models should be self-paced by the learner. Let there be no equivocation, let there be no confusion on that issue. I'm arguing for that categorically and fervently, okay? So we're arguing here that the premise of mastery can only be achieved if self-pacing is enabled. Let me put it another way for you. Let's take a worksheet 7.4. Worksheet 7.4, I give it to little Johnny and I give it to little Julie. Here's the worksheet. Little Johnny might need longer than little Julie, or vice versa, to master that worksheet. So why would I give them the same amount of time to achieve that? Because I'd only do that if I assume that Julie can only achieve to a certain level. Well, I can never know that about Julie, or extremely rarely. Julie can, but she can do it when there's a pacing that suits her, and of course a massive amount of support around. Another point that I want to get to, and I will get to the nitty-gritty of how in a moment as well. We're arguing here that the only target is mastery. Now, I don't think it's possible to define mastering physical education, mastering mathematics, mastering French. I don't think you can truly define that. But I'm pretty confident that for Julie, I can confidently say I can define mastering a worksheet, or mastering a quiz, or mastering a past paper question, or mastering a practical activity. I'm pretty confident that I can say on that task level that the objective is mastery. So the objective is mastery, but the pacing is variable. Okay. Now, I know some of you are going to come back to me and say, well, how do you know they get to the end point? We are going to address that. Okay, so only target is mastery for all. Let me add that in, for all. And again, sometimes people get a little bit concerned by that comment because there's an assumption within our educational model that some students can achieve that level and some students can't. We broadly call it ability. I'm rejecting that idea fundamentally, and I'm saying that all students can. The research on this basically shows two things. The research shows that something like intellectual capacity, let's loosely call it ability, makes little to no difference on a student's capacity to master most types of information, most types of skill, most types of behavior. Where something like ability might become particularly important is at the truly divergent or creative end of coming up with something completely new. Your Elon Musk's, your Einstein's, your this kind of sort of huge capacity level. At that point, there seems to be some that can and some that can't. That's what the research broadly indicates. But we're not talking about that with a GCSE course. We're not talking about that with an A-level course. And that, to me, suggests that all students can, if we enable a structure, an environment, and a support that enables them to do so. I can only tell you that's my view. I can't tell you it's right for you. I can't, if you like, prove it to you if that's the requirement. I can only tell you what is my experience of working in classrooms, of achieving some hope, some really positive things, and perhaps more importantly, the fact that I'm willing to come on to something like this and put this kind of contrary or counterculture argument forward and to back it utterly. So we're saying the only target is mastery for all. More details on that in a second. Another point we would need to have here, we would need to have all resources always accessible. Now, let me be clear with what I mean by resources. We mean with resources which are self-paced, which are variable, which demand mastery. One of those resources is teaching, okay? Or let's call it explanation. That might be a better way of terming what I mean, actually. The delivery of information, the description of how things work needs to be available always. All resources, always, I was meant to say available, wasn't it? I'm sure you guys realised before that I did. Always available. Okay, all resources, always available. Now, you have to decide in your own models how that would be achieved, but let me be clear that that's what I'm talking about. And finally, on this point, we need to develop a model where errors are indicators. Errors are like indicators. Literally, it's like someone's putting their indicator on and saying, I'm turning left. That's what an error should be doing for us. It should be, we got that one wrong, or I got that one wrong. That's interesting. Now I know what I need to do. That's what an error should mean. Errors are indicators that learning is about to happen. Learning is about to happen. Now, I have terrible problems with this concept within my own life, because I have to go to my children's school on parents' evening, and I beg at times for diagnostic information about where my children's strength and weakness are in, say, mathematics. I'm not particularly interested in the global point of your child is above or at or below national standard. I'm not particularly interested in they got this on their test score. I want to know, do they need support in how to divide negative numbers or not? Because if they do, I'm going to provide that support, as the teacher would, for example. And that's what we're talking about with this notion of diagnostics. So our model should bring about this concept of diagnostics intrinsically. If we are using testing and it's not for that, we have to ask some serious questions about what the purpose and role of that testing is. Again, I accept that's a provocative statement, but that's how I see it. Okay, let me turn my page. Might need to take a little moment a second just to sip my drink, but for now, let's keep going. So, look, I want to suggest to you a couple of main advantages. Okay, main advantages as to what I've just described. Okay, main advantages. So there are a couple of things. First of all is that there's no labeling, zero labeling. Everybody is aiming to achieve the same outcome, but the process and the pathway is different. Now, you will find if you introduce a mastery level that you get labeling around pacing and timing. You have to manage that in the early periods, because you will find that some people streak ahead and you will find that some people hover around in the early stages. That can lead to a form of labeling because it's kind of what we're accustomed to. You have to manage that process. You get gigantic increases in confidence in a mastery model. Now, this is not necessarily immediate. Okay, what you're going to find is if you apply a mastery model to, I don't know, 4 lessons, a block of 4 lessons, you're going to have some students who self-pace and fly off into the future and if you like, master or complete the tasks that have been set for them very, very rapidly. And those are probably going to be students who you predict would do that. And you're going to have a group of students who hover around the first few tasks or the first few experiences, the first few episodes, and it takes them longer to get to the behavior of mastery. But once they achieve that first one, those students who may well have never achieved mastery before in anything, certainly in the classroom, all of a sudden you're going to see them start to believe in themselves. And we've found time after time after time, I mean, I can't tell you how regular this is, that those students that hover around and take their time to begin with to master, they not only catch up their peers, but very frequently overtake them, because it's like a new world to them. So you will get a lot more one-to-one time with students. Okay, so mastery learning involves an awful lot of one-to-one. I would broadly call that the coaching model. Okay, you're going to have a lot more personalized messaging with your students, and that's going to be quite common. You're also going to find that students don't get stuck. Okay, let me rephrase that. Students don't get stuck as much. And what I mean by that is that because they're going to have resources available to them continuously and constantly, including teaching, for example, because they're going to have much more access to their teacher, their methodology of resolving being stuck is going to be achieved, is going to be obvious. And the other point we make about that stuckness is that stuckness will be an indicator of something really positive. It'll be, I need to sort this bit out. I need to address this. And that's going to lead to an idea that errors are positive. Okay, imagine errors are positive. Now, we're not saying errors are positive in an exam, in a formal external exam. Of course, that's the point where, like the surgeon who, given my lifestyle at the moment, will one day do my quadruple bypass. I don't want him to make errors when I'm lying there, or a member of my family is, or whatever. But what I want her to do, that surgeon, is I want her during her practice to make as many mistakes as she needs to absolutely master that skill or that knowledge or that behavior, the behavior of controlling anxiety, the behavior of how to hold a knife, the skill of making the incision, whatever. I want all those mistakes to happen in the practice, which is a bit like the classroom, a bit like the homework, so that when they come to perform, it's all being ironed out. And that's what we're interested in. And final point before I really get into the how of this. We have much more data in this model, and we're arguing that every task should produce data. If it doesn't, then ultimately what that's going to lead to is that the teacher has to produce the data. We want the tasks and the students to produce the data, and the teachers to respond. So students produce, and that's often going to be through completing something. Teachers respond. Okay? So students produce data and teachers respond to data. If that's not the scenario you're working in now, and for many of us it won't be, and it wasn't for the majority of my career, we need to address that. That is essential, because it would suggest something endemic and systemic is not working. Even if we're getting good results, by the way, just adjusting my microphone again. So here's how. This here is a GCSE course. It's a real GCSE course. This is how we're working with a GCSE course right now. Some of you will know which course this is. That doesn't matter for this case. But I want to show you how we operate our courses. And obviously, when you look at this, it kind of might freak you out a little bit. I understand that. I'm not interested in telling you what you already know. I'm not here to show you this is kind of like the average experience. I'm here to say, look, there are alternatives, and this is one of the alternatives that I believe in. So let me talk you through this process. So we've got this was in by the way, this was in 2016, 2017. This is the model for a year 10 group. I should have said that. This is the model for a year 10 group in 2016, 2017 for one of the new GCSE courses. So we started here, and as you can see, we have an intro lesson, much like I'm sure you do within your classrooms as well. But immediately we go into a self-paced structure. SP means self-paced. What do we mean by that? That means that every student is working towards a series of targets, and the only objective of every target is mastery. But the order the students do that in, the pace at which it takes, is decided by the student. Now, that does not mean a woolly, soft environment. It doesn't mean that students float around and never get there. It means that they're under real pressure, in a positive way, I hope, to get to the point where they need to be ready, because we get to this point here, which we call a checkpoint, and we're going to call this one checkpoint 1, and you can see what they're doing. They're identifying, describing, and illustrating around this stuff about the skeleton. They're going to get to this checkpoint, and as a minimum standard, every student has to reach that checkpoint having mastered the targets and being ready to take effectively this assessment, this checkpoint. Now, how formalized you want to make an assessment in the second week of a course is up to you. For me, it's not the most formal experience ever because I want it to bed in a little bit first. But that's your call. But for me, every student gets it. But let me be clear, if I've got 5 students in this group who happen to have completed their work before their mastery targets before checkpoint 1, it's absolutely fine for them to go on to material for checkpoint 2. Okay, they can move on, but they're coming back that day to do checkpoint 1 with everybody else. So for me at the moment, and by the way, we see this very much as a hybrid model. This is not where we see it in 5 years' time, just where we are with it right now. This hybrid model, the checkpoints are standardized rhythms, okay? But every single target produces data as we go, every single one. So the students are working towards targets. They know they've got their checkpoint in, say, 3 lessons' time, or 4, or whatever it happens to be, and they know the minimum standard on every target is mastery. How they then get there is up to them. They have complete choice of rhythm, direction, location. Now, we don't allow them to wander around in the corridors. I'm sure you won't be able to either in your classroom, but there might be some flexibility in school. You might have a couple of zones that are usable to you. It becomes flexible. You might have, again, another methodology here. Let's say that these were, I think there's 8 targets there. Let's say that these were our 8 targets for a student to get to before checkpoint 1. Those targets are both classwork and they are homework. And of course, if the student is diligent, then they don't get homework because they complete and master within the class. Equally, if they get confused and stuck in the class, they do it for homework, you know. They get to manage that rhythm and that behavior. Okay, a couple of other things. I'm just going to sort of highlight something that I think is really important to you. Notice what we are talking about here. We are talking about skills and content. That I'm a bit annoyed with myself. We should really call that knowledge, not content. You know what I mean. You see here, this is often what we focus on as teachers. You know, sedentary lifestyle, warm up and cool down, levers, planes, axes, whatever. What we're arguing in our classrooms is the thing that we focus on as the teacher is the skill. The skill of describing, explaining, the skill of analysing, summarising, illustrating. That's really what our target is. And we're using the knowledge as a conduit or as a channel to get to that skill. That's how our mastery classroom works. We are interested in mastering the skill and we use the content to get to that skill. Okay, so a couple of other features of this kind of overall structure that we use. You see here that checkpoints are pretty regular. Checkpoints about every 2 weeks, give or take. And these are, you know, think about them in any use of the word assessment that you have familiarity with. But for us, they are not just tests. We a much better frame of mind for them would be diagnostics. And one of the things we like to say about the checkpoints is the checkpoints should confirm that which we already know from our targets. That which we already know is confirmed within the diagnostic test. And of course, the advantage of the checkpoint then is if there's something we haven't picked up on, you know, student X actually has a weakness in topic Y, we can pick up on it through that checkpoint, and then all the resources are available, we can go back and address it. So that's really important. A couple of other things you'll notice in here is we do build in structurally things like practical. And when I'm talking about practical here, I'm not talking about increasing practical assessment grades. I'm talking about practical exemplification of ideas and learning. We're going to go and do a heart rate practical. We're going to go and do an energy balance practical. We're going to, whatever it happens to be. That's what we're building into our structure. So literally we have our structure mapped out. Okay, now, obviously, you've got to have a look at your school calendar before you do something like that. You need to know what's going to happen. You know, if you get 2 weeks of heavy snowfall, you need to be communicating with the students to say to them, it might be snowing you lot, but you're still getting to where we said. Do the checkpoint online if necessary. I'll come back to that point later, something interesting about that. And you'll notice that as we get down here, we get to the idea that by the end of year 1, so this is the end of year 1, not only have the students basically finished this apparently massive GCSE, but they've mastered it and we get to a point where we have a diagnostic for the summer study prep. Okay, so think about this checkpoint 19 almost like as a mock exam, and it becomes a diagnostic for the summer study prep. We mark it, we get it in, and then we diagnostically advise where students should be implementing their time over that summer holiday. And that is a very, very worthwhile model. So look, I've kind of gone over the advantages up here. I'm not going to go over that point in any more detail. There are some disadvantages here. I haven't taken my little break and realize you guys are probably sick to the back teeth of me already. There are some disadvantages to this model. Do we need, for example, new resources? I'm sure that's something that you guys are going to ask me about in a few moments' time. Okay, new resources. Now, two things I would say on that is that, first of all, these targets, this tutorial, what have we got here, this worksheet, they're exactly the same resources that we would produce for an individual lesson anyway, apart from the teaching is recorded. But there's no additional resource build time. There's just a front loading of resources, okay, or availability of resources. So one of the things I'd say to you about that one is, if we're talking about new resources, can we make an argument that our first step would not be a full course implementation? Could we identify a 4-lesson block, or could we use this in some kind of other support or revision structure, for example? The other thing I'd say about resources is that they change. At least some of them do, okay? Because all of a sudden, a resource that is not being driven home by the teacher, the rhythm by the teacher, needs to develop this sort of magical notion of intuition in students. And also, it may well be that a student does a worksheet before they take the core teaching. So the worksheet has to develop or be a first access resource. So in that sense, we might have some different resources we have to consider. This is definitely the biggest disadvantage I found, is that all the times that I do it, this is not happening in other subjects, different to other subjects. So the skills that I develop with my students are almost wasted in other subjects, really, or the skills, another way of putting it is the skills that students are developing in other subjects are almost wasted in our model. They're not particularly relevant. Sit still, listen to me, here's my teaching, take some notes, now do the worksheet, now move on. Those things are not particularly useful because they're timed and paced externally, often by the teacher. And what we're saying here is that we don't get a match up easily with that, and that is a problem. So I make no bones about it. You have to consider it. We've got another point here, which is about course delivery. Okay, some of you, no doubt, will fear this idea of falling behind. The only thing falling behind of students who don't meet targets, for example, the only thing I can say to you about that one is that in the experience I've had of working like this, I've had no experiences whatsoever where students don't make the checkpoint unless something has gone wrong. Okay, if someone's ill, they're going to miss a checkpoint. But that's going to happen in the model anyway. If someone suffers a bereavement, or I don't know, or mum and dad book a holiday, there's not much you can do about that one. You've got to manage it in the best way possible. But other than that, your students are going to make that checkpoint if you have a robust and supportive environment around them. Okay, so, but that will be a fear, I'm sure, for some of us. And the other point is that some will find this threatening. Okay, now I don't know if you do. I don't know if colleagues around you would, but some people are going to see this as a threatening or as a big change. I can't answer that for anybody else. That's for you to decide. I can only give you my experiences. For me, it's been an extremely liberating experience, so I can only speak highly of it. The only other point I wanted to make on disadvantages, and it's become more and more of a marginal point now, is that you've got to think about the technological aspects of this. In order, for example, for online teaching to be available to your students in the classroom, you need to have a small number of devices in that classroom on a regular basis. You've got to think about that. And I also want to make the point to you is that if your resources are available digitally, you've got to think about the notion of the digital divide. Some students, about 7% apparently in the UK, don't have access to internet at home. That number's getting smaller all the time, so that's something you might want to monitor when you first start this process. Is the internet available at home? Do you want to do some kind of survey? Do you want to invite people to come talk to you and to raise the issue? What support mechanisms would you put in place with that? Right, final things for me before we get out of this. Final things for me that I kind of want to address are what might your next steps be? I've mentioned a couple of these already. Okay, so next steps. I think for me, the first thing is to talk and challenge. Okay, is to think about the idea and to look at existing practices, look at existing assumptions or departmental structures, and to challenge those things. So to talk and to challenge about these things is important. This might sound woolly, but question everything. Okay, so what I mean by that is, have a think about why things are being done the way that they are being done. And if you can't immediately come to an educationally ideological answer to that, then you can probably challenge why that's being done. A couple of things. I'm going to say that you could ID something like a 4-part topic. I don't know if you've got energy systems coming up or engagement patterns coming up. Identify a 4-part topic and have a go. Self-paced. You know the classroom already that we work in. You can adopt that one. Self-paced, mastery-based. See how your students respond. See what happens. And that could come in a different format as well. It could be your revision structure. It could be your drop-ins, or you could set up like a clinic type structure for students to come in, to get involved with sort of drop-ins. I've always found that drop-ins don't work particularly well, but maybe that's just the way that I'm doing them. And this one is a really important one. It's kind of the summary point I'm going to leave you with. Reject broadcast lectures. Whatever you personally put in place instead, reject broadcast lectures. Reject the idea of all students being taught the core content all at the same time, all people facing in the same direction, sometimes in line, sometimes not. Reject that notion as a normal or a typical idea of what a classroom is for. There's no reason to make that assumption. It's not reliable. The research, and certainly my experience, suggests that it's not actually that effective. Do our students leave our lessons or lessons on homework having mastered the content, the skill, and the behaviour before moving on? It's a good question to ask. And if the answer is no, then we don't have to look at the student and the flaws they have. We have to look at the model and the flaws it has. Because I promise you that unless we're talking about a different species of child working in your school or studying in your school, I promise you that they can. I promise you that they can do it. They might need to upskill and might take a few goes at it to start with, but they're able to do it. I feel like I've missed out some key things that I should have said. The only one I'm going to add, because I'll definitely say in a moment, otherwise, what the heck is that? We would argue that if you are going to use any kind of technology to enable this, we're going to please request that only 1/4 maximum of your lesson time is what we call screen time. At least three quarters should be doing, writing, discussing, debating, one-to-one, target review. 3/4 should be doing those things. 1/4 should be screen time. So really limit that down. Okay, let me come back onto the camera, and we're gonna talk about a couple of other points, and I'll hopefully take some questions from you guys.
So I had I had the volume turned down there on the on the microphone we switched to. So yeah, hopefully everyone can hear and see and what have you, and you get the glamour of looking at me for a little bit longer. So lucky you people. Yeah. So look, hopefully that's a relevant and interesting session for people. It's for me, it's at the core of that topic. It's at the core of where we should be. It's at the core of the only way in which I can work with young people or in education going forward. It's not possible for me to go to the other model, the other methodology, the kind of the I don't know how to word it, because it always seems summative, a whole range of so many different experiences, but that kind of controlled from the front classroom, or whatever term we would use for that, that's not something that I would be able to go back to now. Or I don't know, could I? There are bits about it I really enjoyed. I enjoyed being a bit of a showman at the front of the class, to be honest. Probably why I do this sort of stuff now, actually. But the difference in output is so gigantic that it would be almost impossible to go back to that for me. So anyway, that's that. I'm looking for questions from people. So I would really value people firing things away, firing things in. And I know Mike's just sent me a couple of messages, and Wendy was saying they're not a question, but I would urge people to have a go. One of the things that's probably reasonable to describe at this point is that we've got a group of now between 20 and 30 teachers who are part of our pioneers group. And an EverLearner pioneer is someone who is effectively using this model on some kind of regular or frequent basis. And that model is being applied to some degree successfully. Now, Wendy is a magnificent exponent of that. Not only is she doing that with her own practice, but she's also inspiring other people in her school to be following a model which is somehow related or somehow similar. And that's a fascinating thing. But this pioneers group are people who are proving, for a long time, I felt that I was on my own doing this. I was sort of doing this in PE, and it was kind of, I'm sure there are elements for other people doing too that were similar, but it was me kind of like ploughing this land fresh and just on my own. And now we've got a whole sort of group of teachers who are doing similar things, which is, in my opinion, both inspiring and exciting. And I wonder where the tipping point is. Where is the tipping point at 50 PE teachers, where all of a sudden a whole massive amount of data comes out of that scenario, those series of scenarios, and improvements get made, or is it 100 teachers, or is it 200? At what point does that tipping point happen, at which this model just becomes normality? Now, one of the things I'd talk about in this sense is the notion of change. We're talking about a kind of a dramatic change in how classrooms are presented. So we have to think about what's the reality of how that change is going to be implemented. And excuse me, I think it's probably fair to say that if we just try and tweak and adapt what's already in place and bolt things on top of the current model, which I think has become very popular and visible through various avenues, not least social media, where the model basically stays the same, and we bolt onto it a 5-minute this, or we bolt onto it some other idea. What we're talking about, I think, from our perspective, is just creating a completely alternative model, and it just being such an obvious and attractive proposition that people will automatically gravitate to us. I guess that gravitate towards it. Now, that's going to take some time. It's going to take some energy, but I don't think it's going to take as long as people probably think it's going to do. So I'm just going to pause here and just to see what people are saying here. So I've got one here from Mickey Riddle in Birmingham. Interesting. At what point is mastery achieved? Is consistently gaining top marks, or just the one attempt? For me, Mickey, mastery is at the task level. I am not qualified to say what mastering a subject is. Not actually a real thing. It's a nebulous concept that we just kind of, or a categorization. So for me, mastery is only, first of all, it's only at the task level, and it's only momentary. So mastery is also a fleeting thing. Mastery is not something that is permanent. If a student, for example, masters a task, I don't know, they do a 6-mark question and get 6 marks, that means that they were able to achieve that 6 marks in that moment. It doesn't mean that they've we shouldn't see mastery as a permanent setting. It's simply like any assessment, really. It's simply assessments can only assess, whether it's a learning activity or a test, whatever. They can only assess moments. They can't assess settings, at least in the minds of young people. So that for me is a really important point. Now, how you define mastery exactly, I think, is a very personal thing. The way I do it is I try to make the tasks and therefore the targets as robust and as concise and as specific as possible, so that we can literally see and measure mastery. But that doesn't mean that every connection and repetition and reinforcement of the mind has been made. That still may need to come. But at least that's my definition. So I'm just picking up on other things here. In fact, Mike's very kindly sending it to me on my other screen here. So we'll just be looking down for a second here. So yeah, Christian, James, I'm finding it hard to motivate students who are used to being so much spoon-fed, and when I ask them to think for themselves, it can break down. How can you advise? I wouldn't be daft enough to advise, Christian. That's the first thing. I don't know your students. I don't know your school setting in detail, so I would never be presumptuous enough to say to you, you should do X, Y, and Z. I think there's a couple of kind of philosophical stances to take, however, that might be useful for you. First of all, I think you've got to expect the normality of what you've just described. You know, I think you've got to see that as a normal situation, and I think you've got to accept it as part of the process. And I guess, what does that mean in reality? I guess that means, like any change or transformation process, you have to honour the letting go part to begin with, and you see that as normal. Now, we also have to say that you must not risk anything within that model. You know, so if there's going to be kind of this notion of collateral damage and students doing worse, then you need to change that. Let's be blunt. We're not saying, this is not a religion. We're not saying to you, this is the only way and you must do it this way. What we'd encourage you to do is implement it, monitor it, look at it, test it, if need be, withdraw it, change it, implement it again in blocks or sections or in areas, whatever is relevant in the setting, and then withdraw it and look at it again. Now, if you think about it in this context, Christine, it took me about 5 years to get to a model I was really satisfied with. Okay, so we made sure that within that process, students were doing really, really well, and we implemented gradually, and we looked at things, and we tested. We didn't have kind of the vision that kind of, I guess, we're trying to provide for you guys in this scenario, but we were willing to take those calculated risks, step back, look at it, put it back in again. And I think you've got to see a normality to that. Now, we don't think it's going to take you 5 years, because we're trying to create the image of this, of what it might be like, but I think that would be a useful thing. In terms of motivation, I don't think we can blame something that's new for, let's call it some kind of structural indifference. You know, where's that come from? There's got to be something to that. And as you said, that kind of spoon feed things. So I guess other little tricks are investing, discussing the model with the students, give some time to that, explain to them why, explain to them that you think it'll be good for them, explain to them, you know, even invest by communicating with the parents as well. Say why you're going to do it, when you're going to do it, when you're going to implement it, when you're going to remove it, and so on. Invest in those things, and I think that'll be beneficial for you. Anyway, I'm rambling on, so I'm going to move on. Wendy's response to Christian: can I suggest to Christian to really start slowly? I had this with my lower 6 and almost went lesson by lesson until they got the hang of it and could see the benefits. I think that's great advice as well, Wendy. I mean, I agree. I have to say, Wendy, I'm my nature is it. I'm somewhat of a. I don't have much grey in me. You know, I kind of shift, and I have to do that thing. You can call that a risk taker or whatever. That's just me personally. So for me, I made quite big changes early. But for me, the key was that when it wasn't working, I withdrew it, looked at it, remodeled it, and put it back in. So it's whether you can, which of those strategies you want to go with. But I would definitely encourage you to see the normality of it not being perfect immediately. I think that's important. One of the things I want to do is, and I'm hoping my sound's going to stay here. Just bear with me 1 second. Just going to put this on the screen. Yeah, I think we've got good sound, so we're absolutely fine. So it looks like a crazy thing, right? This this model of this equation here. This is what we call our success equation. And what we mean by this, is that success is actually it's actually identifiable within this format. Okay. So let me just define for you what it means. The S means success, and we're saying success equals something. And we're saying success equals familial involvement, you know, like support at home, stuff you would expect, multiplied by behaviors. Behaviors are learning behaviors. We're talking about things such as engagement, concentration, repetition, completion. We're talking about things such as perseverance, effort, time, those sort of behaviors. Not about behavior management stuff here. And we multiply that component with resources. Now, for us, resources are things such as self-paced, continuously available resources which demand mastery from the student, including the teaching. Okay, so the resource of teaching from the front in a one-pace-fits-all model, we would not include as a resource of value within this particular consideration. But this bit underneath is really important. If you were to get these top things brilliant, you know, like brilliant familiar involvement, fantastic learning behaviors, magnificent resources that the students have available to them constantly, that develop intuition, that are self-paced and so on. But if the students are, as they go, developing what we call the MD, that's mastery deficit, that's going to undermine all those things that are above. So for us, it's really important that with that MD, we're minimizing it as much as possible. So a true educational model should enable students to master concepts, behaviors, and skills as they go. That's minimizing that mastery deficit. And secondly, it should allow students to go back to that material, however long ago that material was, if they need to. And of course, that has an implication for resources. And finally, we multiply all of that by what we call valuable time. Valuable time, I'll come back onto the screen just for a second. Valuable time is two things for us. Valuable time is time spent in deep concentration. A really great question to ask yourself after the session is, if I watch my students for an hour in my lesson, or if I go and observe someone else's lesson, how much time are students spending in genuine deep concentration? So how much concentration is, and one of the ways you can know students are in concentration is that they can't maintain it. If students are genuinely concentrating, they will not be able to do it for an hour. They'll be able to switch on, and then they're going to have to come out of it. That's why we have our zoned classroom, partly, so it allows mobility and movement from one modality to another. The other valuable time is valuable time with a teacher. Now, for us, I can only speak for us, valuable time for a teacher only includes personalized direct communication between the teacher, the coach, the facilitator, and the learner. It does not include, we do not value one-pace-fits-all rhythmical models of communication which treat all students effectively in the same way. So we reject that idea of valuable time. We only value the valuable time as I've just described. So that model there, and we've got that available through our Education Reimagined publication, that model there is something that I'd really encourage you to reflect on. Now, I'm going to put it back on the screen just briefly. I know it's a mad thing, but I think it's worth just having another little look at. This equation here is so central to our work that if something goes wrong, we know that it's gone wrong with one of these variables. So if something goes wrong in our classroom, the only variables of value to us are those that are included there. That is where we're going to look for solving that problem. Okay. Now, I'll go back to Christian's point about motivation. Of course, we need to somehow draw that out of the student and allow the student to find that in themselves, absolutely, because otherwise that's going to be a very, very limiting factor. But that's where we're going to look for. That's where we're going to go to look for solutions to problems. And that is also, I mean, if you look at that equation, as crazy as it looks, can you see that in what was probably more familiar, which is kind of the curriculum plan we showed earlier, that kind of row of topic areas and skills, and we go through week 1, week 2. That model is built into that. That sort of Excel sheet is literally this equation applied to a learning model. So for me, and I've said this on numerous points before, for me, one of the key things that we have to do as course managers, curriculum managers, classroom teachers, as senior leaders, whatever it happens to be, we have to identify what our educational core is and then apply that in a robust and consistent way in our actual models that we offer to learners. And if we're not doing that, then the only alternative is we're making assumptions. And if we're making assumptions, well, maybe we'll get lucky and we'll get it right and we'll do well. But assumptions are kind of risky things because it means that we can be very easily left behind or very easily surpassed. And that's something that I'd encourage people to have a bit of a think about. I don't know if we've got any other questions. I know Mike's been sending a couple of things in for us. The only thing I kind of wanted to finish off on, and please forgive me for it, but I just wanted you guys to know that we've just launched these are, well, they're not that little actually. These things here. These are our roadmap A3 learning mats, and the idea of this is that I didn't get a pen ready actually. I should have done. The idea of this is that from our roadmap sort of writing model, students can literally plan their little roadmaps as they need to by drawing on here and using the roadmap to plan quality answers. If that's something of interest to you, just get in touch. We've got quite a few, so get in touch and we can provide those. So they're really nice things. Some of you are already using them, and if you're not, perhaps you'd like to get involved. So, look, I'm gonna start to sign off. If anybody has any questions, feel free. I'm not flying off anywhere this very moment, but if anybody wants to ask any questions, please do so. And I guess for me, just kind of signing off a little bit, I hope that's been a relevant and provocative session for people. It's funny, really. I mean, we talk about. I actually almost feel like this is old hat. You know, like I've probably been talking about this in public for 2 or 3 years now. What's nice about it now is I don't mean to pick specifically on Wendy or Christian, for example, but we've got people literally applying these models and getting similar outputs to those that I've been getting as well. And it's kind of weird because, as I said before, for a long time I felt like it was just me, and now we've got a bit of a group of people who are starting to believe in it and what have you. And sometimes I sort of catch myself doing this, and I sort of think, James, haven't you got any new ideas? Haven't you got anything to kind of add to that? But I think one of the refreshing things about this mastery thing is I don't think it will ever change a great deal, because I think if you truly reflect on how learning embeds in people, I think you ultimately always come back to something around this notion of mastery. If you take to, I don't know, riding a bike, for example, I'm sure many of us have had this experience as parents, where your child you're just about to let go of that thing where you're running along, you're just about to let go of that seat, and the child's probably like 40% cyclist at that point, just as you're about to let go. Right, they're just about balancing and staying up, and I think sometimes what happens in the traditional educational model is what we should do is, we should keep offering the right level of challenge until they truly master that thing, right? But I think what often happens in the educational model, this is going to be like a dramatic example, is we go from that experience of them just about let go of that seat, we go from that to, without any other process taking place, we go from there and we sort of hand them a unicycle. We say, right, here's the next challenge. But they're not ready. The cyclists, they're 40, 60% cyclists. That needs to come later when they're ready. For now, they need to take their time and master that skill. Or if we were teaching juggling, we're not going to take someone who's just about to get 3 balls in the end to keep them up consistently. We're not going to give them a load of fire batons at that point. It would be dangerous. The chances of loss, of risk, of failure are very, very high. Okay, they're extreme examples because people could get hurt, but you take my point, that the impression we could give to young people if they're not ready to move on to those things, or if it's too early for them, is that you're not up to it and you should be. But in reality, perhaps taking more time to master the core components, and especially the skills, is going to enable down the line a much more coherent experience of truly learning something the way it should be learned. Anyway, that's just me banging on, and yeah, that's really nice. I mean, I must mention Karen Davies here. Karen is a brilliant colleague based over in Brussels. Actually, Karen, I should mention this while I'm on. I don't know whether I'm allowed to make political statements or not. I might actually be in Brussels next week, Karen. I forgot to tell you this when we spoke the other day, because I've been invited to go to a protest for the release of the Catalan politicians in Brussels. That's a long story, but I might be going next week. I'll let you know if I'm going to be there. But it could be nice. But you're saying there, discuss this equation with a group of teachers at a recent in-house CPD session. Really interesting discussions. That's a great thing to hear. I completely agree with that. I mean, it's about generating discussions and provoking, and if need be, prodding, in a supportive way. Wendy's saying there, look forward to meeting up with you both on the 11th of December. Yeah, we've got our just the room next to us. Actually, we've got our Pioneers Day together on the 11th of December. When it's going to be there. Dan Hutchison, yes, James. I think the important element is that this is not a fad like so many things that come into teaching. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's a lot of fads, right? Wow. One thing I think I can promise you, Dan and everyone else, is that we're not going anywhere. There's certain days where what we're trying to achieve seems massively distant. Today, in many ways, has been one of the worst days of my professional career for a number of reasons. I'm not going to go into it. I don't want to get all negative, but we've had a really shocking day. And we've ended it in a positive way by doing this session. So that's really good. And sometimes in days like that, it can feel really distant. When we come back to talk about this post 31st of January, which is when we anticipate launching the service, which is going to sit directly on top of this ideology, I think we're going to be talking about something really interesting. At that point, I won't go into too many more details now because we don't have time. But yeah, it's going to be something interesting. Fads, yeah, we should look out for them in education, but we shouldn't be so close-minded as to miss these ones too. Because if we label everything a fad, then obviously we miss the good stuff as well. But yeah, being discerning is important. That's why putting these sessions on and asking people to buy in, I suppose, I don't mean financially, but to listen and to discuss and to think. I mean, I think that's a really valuable thing. Anyway, I'm banging on, so I'm going to stop. But yeah, guys, a huge thank you to you. I'm going to stop the stream now. I really appreciate you giving up a Tuesday afternoon And I really hope we see each other soon. We've got one more session before Christmas, and we'll be in touch about that for the CPD in the coming days. And I wish you all the very, very best. And I appreciate very much you being a positive influence on what has been a somewhat hellish day. So thanks again, and have a good evening. Take care.